Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome. It's very nice of you to join our expert consultation on countering hate speech through interfaith dialogue and multi-stakeholder partnerships. This event is being hosted by the International Dialogue Centre, KAICIID, in partnership with the European Council of Religious Leaders, Religions for Peace Europe, and with the kind support of the OSCE's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, ODIHR. We are very grateful for their support and for all of your presence here with us today. As many of you know, this event marks for KAICIID the beginning of its systematic work in Europe. The Centre has worked on countering hate speech for several years worldwide. However, in 2021, we are for the first time beginning a European regional programme, including a project to counter hate speech by empowering religious leaders and communities to become even more effective agents for countering hate speech and promoting social cohesion. This initiative does not take place in a void. Many of Europe's most renowned governmental and faith-based institutions have been working on this problem for years. We are here to hear from you, to learn from your successes and struggles, and to ensure that our future endeavours together build upon and complement the wonderful work which you have been doing and the partnerships which you have forged. I'd like to give you a few words of technical guidance before we begin. Firstly, this meeting will run until 5, and it will consist of 2 panels and 2 breakouts, separated by a 10-minute coffee break. We hope to give as many people as possible the chance to express themselves interactively, so please also make active use of the chat. But I'd ask you to keep your microphones off during the plenary sessions. Please note that the meeting is being recorded and plenary sessions will be live streamed. The link to the YouTube channel will soon be posted in the chat, and you're of course welcome to share that with anyone who might be interested in following us on YouTube. Please note that in the breakout sessions, which will not be streamed, the Chatham House rule applies. I'd also like to add that we have English-French interpretation available via Interprefy. If you have not already done so, you're invited to download the application to your desktop. We are advised not to use both that application and Zoom on the same mobile phone, so either divide them between your devices or have both on the desktop. There's a token specifically for this event which you can find in the chat. If you have any difficulties, please get in touch with our team and we'll do our best to help. Now, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce His Excellency Mr. Faisal bin Muaammar, Secretary General of KAICIID, to open the event. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francis. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed religious leaders, on behalf of KAICIID, the International Dialogue Centre, welcome to this expert consultation on countering hate speech through interfaith cooperation and multi-stakeholders partnership. The objective of this meeting is to share and explore the ways in which endeavors to counter hate speech in Europe and in the world are making an impact and can still be improved, especially through strengthening the link between religious actors and those in policy and civil societies. I am very glad to see the institutional, religious, and geographical diversity represented by the participant here with us today. Thank you to all of you for joining us and for enriching our discussion with your expertise. Your presence here helps us achieve exactly the kind of a cross-sectoral and multi-stakeholder discussion which are the need of the hour. Let me begin with the recognition that hate speech is on the rise. Across the world and here in Europe, hate speech both online and offline is worsening. Racial and social tension and degrading social cohesion. It is contributing to discrimination and in extreme cases leading to incitement of violence and hate crimes. We have all witnessed the worrying rise of populist movements and individualism who use hate speech to spread fear of migrants and minorities, to make them the other. Hate speech breeds by making an enemy out of unknown. The COVID-19 pandemic is making it worse. The rise in online hate speech during the pandemic warns us of potential increases in hate crimes once restrictions are lifted. Religious traditions and secular policymakers, institutions often seem to be unlikely partners in the efforts to counter hate speech. This is especially the case in the European context, where religion is residing from public life. But it is my belief that religious institutions and transitional institutions are in fact united by a faith in the innate dignity of the human being, in the innate value of individuals. The idea that people have the right to be respected and valued, independent of any aspect of their identity, of who they are, but simply because they are. And this is the fundamental truth which is attacked by hate speech and hate crimes. At KAICIID, we are convinced that interreligious dialogue and religious leaders have a role to play in countering hate speech. Interreligious dialogue is a critical factor in preventing hate speech of the conditions it needs to spread. We need to promote an environment that conducive to populism, coexistence, common citizenship. We need interreligious and intercultural dialogue at every level to do this. Now here was KAICIID convening power on this issue, more apparent than at the conference on hate speech that we organized in November 2019. Religious leaders, policymakers, youth and media specialists engaged in an intensive 3-day exchange about damage done by misuse of language, the power of word. In today's workshop and going forward, I look forward to cooperating with many of your institutions to explore how we can develop successful multi-stakeholder partnerships between secular institutions and religious institutions to counter hate speech. How can we empower religious leaders and support policymakers in this effort? How can we support the victims of hate speech and prevent further escalation in the aftermath? How can we protect the right of religious minorities? How can we bolster faith communities to advocate for their own rights and those of others? I am honored to present to you our next speaker, who has engaged deeply with these issues and who has agreed to support KAICIID with its work on this issue. Reverend Dr. Thomas Wipf is the President of the European Council of Religious Leaders Council. I should like to extend my special gratitude to European Council for Religious Leaders, Religions for Peace Europe, which has agreed to work with KAICIID on its project to empower religious leaders to play an even more definitive role in countering hate speech, as well as the OSCE, Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, which has generously offered its support to this event. I would like to, in your behalf, to welcome Dr. Wipf. Please join us. Thank you very much for joining us, and I know your busy time. Grateful to your support and grateful to the support of Religious Council. And I would like to thank all the participants here with us today. So the microphone is yours. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Your Excellency, and many thanks to the KAICIID Europe Region Board for inviting to this expert consultation and for starting the social cohesion initiative. And I want to congratulate KAICIID to build a Europe Region Board. I think this is really important. The 3 pillars of the initiative, each concerning one approach to promoting peaceful, fair, and pluralistic European society, take up the central challenges of living together in Europe and in the various countries. These are topics that concern us very much in the European Council of Religious Leaders as one of the 4 co-committees of Religions for Peace Europe. That is why we gladly accepted the kind invitation to an informal partnership on the social cohesion initiative together with OSCE, ODIHR. The issue of today's expert consultation of countering hate speech will show that this topic can only be tackled jointly by many partners and stakeholders in politics, civil society, and religious communities. I'm therefore pleased and congratulate KAICIID that they have succeeded in attracting such a large number of experts to take part in this consultation. Let me just offer 2 very brief thoughts or considerations. I have become aware more and more of how many forms and topics hate speech is now present. Open and hidden ones, verbal and non-verbal hate speech, and we are confronted with. The Secretary General mentioned this. That is why I would like to underline how important it is to pay attention to this thematically wide area of hate speech. This is also reflected in the carefully elaborated background documents that KAICIID has already presented. I'm grateful for that. In addition to hate speech in the field of religion and followers of certain traditions, we are observing an increase in hate speech towards people with political responsibility, as mentioned, especially during the pandemic, but also populist, nationalist, denigrations of minorities or hate speech towards people with other form of life, for instance, LGBT. I think that it is important and right, especially in the interfaith cooperation, which is in the title of today's consultation, to have this broad approach of combating hate speech. And the second brief consideration, I am convinced that the interfaith cooperation still has more and great potential in this area of countering hate speech, which we may not be aware of. Interfaith cooperation, in cooperation with multi-stakeholder partnership, could also achieve a lot more publicly if we would do it together, mutually supportive for all people, whether religious or not. I'm now looking forward to many inspiring and encouraging contributions in our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wipf, for your insights and for outlining the priorities of the ECRL. I hope that we will definitely go into those areas which you have outlined. It's now my pleasure to invite our moderator for the first panel to open it. I'd like to greet Dr. Elisabetta Kitanovic, Executive Secretary for Human Rights at the Conference of European Churches, along with her speakers.
Thank you, Francis.
I beg your pardon. I'm so sorry, Elisabetta. I have called you out of line. I apologize. We have other questions first. Sorry. Our next speaker is actually Rabbi Goldschmidt, Chief Rabbi Goldschmidt, President of the Council of European Rabbis. Rabbi Goldschmidt, may I invite you to take the floor, and apologies for trying to dismiss you with a panel.
You almost succeeded. Thank you, Francis. I would like to thank, first of all, my friend, His Eminence Faisal bin Muaammar, the Secretary General of KAICIID, for this initiative, which is a wonderful initiative, and also the OSCE and ECRL for joining this initiative to speak about hate speech. I see here among the participants in this panel, my colleagues, the Chief Rabbi of Geneva, Rabbi Dr. Yitzchak Dayan, and the Communal Rabbi of Vienna, Rabbi Hofmeister, who are also very welcome, with all our other friends and the colleagues from other religions. So allow me to start that in the Abrahamic religions, where we share the belief of God's creation of the world, and an essential part of the creation of the world was the Word. And God said, there will be light, and there was light. It were the words which created this world, and it are the words which are destroying this world. And the word of a human being has tremendous power to build and to destroy, to give life and to take life. And it was the Nobel Peace Dr. Elie Wiesel, who said that the crematorium, the gas chambers in Auschwitz, were not built by bricks. They were built by words. It was through a long process of the dehumanization of the other, the dehumanization of Jews in Germany, where they were asked not to walk on the sidewalks. They had to walk in the streets. They were not allowed to go into coffee shops. They were not allowed to go into parks. It was through the slow dehumanization of the other, through words, that it was possible at the end to come and kill 1.5 million children. And this shows us the tremendous power of the word. And we know that in Western society, in the world, we have a very important system of values. And in this system of values, we have the freedom of speech. That every human being has the right to express him or herself. However, this freedom of speech can be and is being abused. And the big question which is now standing in front of society, in front of many lawmakers in many countries, to what extent does freedom of speech extend to the social media, where the power of the word, of the written word, of the spoken word, is dehumanizing the other, is calling for hate speech, and is calling for terrorism, and is endangering the world as we know it. To quote Sacha Baron Cohen, the famous actor who spoke in front of the ADL over 1.5 years ago, he said, if we would use the value of freedom of speech, and Adolf Hitler would have wanted to use this platform on Facebook, would this be beneficial? Or does a freedom of speech mean giving for free a platform for those people and those ideas who can destroy our world? It is a world with no editing. It is a world where people are being linked to other extreme groups, and a place with no controls whatsoever. And we see to what extent the social media, which has been a free-for-all, has become a menace for the lives of many minorities and endangered groups and religions throughout the world. We don't have to forget that the two most outrageous terrorist acts against houses of religious worship, one against a mosque in Christchurch in New Zealand, and also against the synagogue in Pittsburgh were streamed online and were used online by social media. Further than that, we have also the problem is that religious material, religious books, such as the Bible or the Quran or others, are being manipulated by those who want to create a world of terrorism by using words said by prophets and holy people hundreds and thousands of years ago, and use them to manipulate young people and get them to kill others and kill themselves. We, in the Conference of European Rabbis, after the terrific and terrible attacks, Charlie Hebdo in Paris, we came out with a manifesto against religious extremism. And what we suggested is that in every religious congregation, there should be one from within the faith, from inside the faith, who will make sure that religious books and religious texts will not be manipulated in a way which can make young people do atrocious acts and endanger themselves and society. And therefore, the whole idea of KAICIID, together with the OSCE and ECRL, to call on religious leaders and leaders of society to work together, to ban hate speech, to fight hate speech, is a very beneficial idea. And we have to work together because the problem exists everywhere. We have today a radicalization of general society, radicalization of politics. We have the mounting populism among political leaders, and this promotes hate speech. So my dear friends and colleagues, I would like to thank you all for inviting me to say a few words. And I really hope that this seminar, like others organized by KAICIID in the past or in the future, is going to help us to find the road and the roadmap to work together to make this world a safer place, a better place, a place where the word is being used to build, to give life, and not to destroy and take lives away, for our sake and the sake of our children. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Goldschmidt. I'm very glad we put you back in. That was the most valuable insight into the views of the religious community, and particularly a minority which has done so much work in this area. Thank you very much for being with us. I would also invite Dr. Kishan Manocha, Head of Tolerance and Non-Discrimination at OSCE, Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, who would also like to give us a different perspective on the roles of religious and belief actors and leaders and the importance of human rights-centered and multi-actor response on this topic. Dr. Kishan, I'd invite you to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Francis. Good afternoon to everyone. Greetings from Warsaw, Excellency, dear friends. I hope you can all see me and hear me. The OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, or ODIHR, has been given a mandate by the participating states of the OSCE to assist them to foster climates of mutual respect, understanding, and cooperation, grounded in full respect for everyone's fundamental rights and freedoms without distinction. This is integral to the work of ensuring broad-based, sustainable, peaceful coexistence and security in the vast OSCE region. Given the gravity and urgency of the threat posed by hate speech and intolerant discourse to social peace and stability in Europe, ODIHR is therefore very pleased to support this timely and important initiative of the KAICIID Dialogue Center on social cohesion in Europe, and in particular to open a space for discussion with religious and belief actors, including religious leaders, on addressing and countering hate speech and discrimination through interfaith cooperation and multi-stakeholder partnerships. I would like to use this opportunity to really make 5 overarching points in light of ODIHR's ongoing experience of addressing all forms of intolerance, discrimination, and hate and to advance human rights for all in the OSCE region. The first point is to say that what we refer to these days as hate speech is a problem both of long-standing and recent intensification in Europe. Over the decades, its targets have been many and varied. Jews, Muslims, Christians of various denominations, Roma and Sinti, women, migrants, refugees, LGBTQI individuals, persons of color, and persons with disabilities. These are among those who in various contexts have been stigmatized, denigrated, demonized, and against whom discrimination, hostility, or violence has been and continues to be incited. And as we have heard, the current COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated this situation. What we are finding, sadly, regrettably, and disturbingly, is that hate mongers, including organized hate groups as well as individuals, have exploited the conditions created by the pandemic to spread hatred. Through the digital space, they are also able to reach more people than ever before. Harmful stereotypes and tropes are chronically reinforced also by the mainstream media, by powerful politicians, and, dare I say it, some religious leaders, as well as influencers of popular culture and academic discourse. So hate speech and intolerant discourse have now become part of the mainstream discourse. And so any efforts to address these phenomena must reckon with this fact. So those engaged in efforts to address and counter hate speech need to be sensitized to the various forms it takes, the various spaces in which it is expressed, the various individuals, groups who perpetrate it, the identity of those that hate speech affects, and the nature and extent of its impact on them, among other things. The second point I wish to make is that hate speech is, as we know, a symptom of something more profound, namely intolerance, prejudice, and bigotry, and its pernicious effects go beyond its victims, because it represents an attack on the values that all of society holds dear, such as tolerance, inclusivity, and equality. So a comprehensive response, whether in terms of measures to be taken or actors to be engaged, is required. Legal responses such as restrictions on freedom of expression alone are far from sufficient to bring about real changes in mindset, perceptions, and discourse. The larger picture of hostility, of hate towards any kind of diversity or difference, religious or otherwise, demonstrates that we must solve this crisis more holistically. So only through a multifaceted, multidimensional, and multi-stakeholder response will we be able to address the manifold repercussions of hate speech. And we should never assume that any one group or any one community is going to be able to carry the burden of protection, nor can any one NGO do so. So we need to build, operationalize, and sustain partnerships, networks, and coalitions among relevant stakeholders. Indeed, I would say we have reached a moment where collaboration is essential. The civic space is being eroded every day, the world over, including in the OSCE region. So in order to uphold and strengthen this shrinking civic space, communities, groups, organizations, educators, local authorities, to name but some of the key actors to be engaged in efforts to address and counter hate speech, must find ways to work together across it. The third point is that it concerns the crucial role of religious and belief actors, including religious leaders. And this role should be considered within this holistic, comprehensive response framework. ODIHR has found religious and belief actors to be essential collaborators when addressing the drivers of hate speech, whether cultural, religious, individual, social, political, economic, because these actors have influence and reach into areas and deep connections to people and communities in which many of the drivers are rooted. Additionally, as we have heard, they can contribute to a solid foundation on which to address these issues through interfaith dialogue, engagement, and partnerships. Religious and belief actors potentially bring to this work formidable intellectual, moral, and practical resources, as well as, of course, spiritual resources that can help to build, strengthen, and sustain societal resilience against expressions and manifestations of intolerance in hate. Indeed, in some quarters of European society, religious leaders have been front and center as activists and community leaders, responding to the new challenges presented by exclusionary and illiberal identity politics, of which we have also heard. Nevertheless, the potential of religious and belief actors and communities to become positive factors of societal resilience against hate speech and intolerant discourse still requires further exploration in order to be fully understood. My fourth point is that in any activities to address and counter hate speech, the gender dimension warrants special attention, as women frequently suffer from complex and intersectional stigmatization and discrimination that renders them particularly vulnerable to hate propaganda and concomitant manifestations of contempt. So all actors engaged in this multifaceted work need to be committed to addressing all forms of gender-based hate and violence in their responses. And finally, my fifth point is that respect and protection of human rights must be part of the solution. It is important that any collaborative networks or coalitions among civil society actors, including religious or belief leaders, communities and actors, to promote dialogue, understanding, solidarity, and inspire constructive action, commit to the rights and freedoms enshrined in international human rights law, including, but not only, freedom of expression, freedom of original belief, and women's rights and gender equality. Particular care, therefore, should be taken to ensure that collaborative efforts, including in the field of interfaith dialogue and partnerships, are inclusive and accessible to all, as failure to do so might contribute to reinforcing various stereotypes and forms of intolerance, the very things that these activities are designed to counter. So in this connection, interfaith dialogue initiatives and projects should always take into account existing and emerging religious or belief diversity and be open to minorities who are often ignored in such efforts, while also ensuring the substantive participation of women and youth. Indeed, interfaith youth action is an area of particular promise in Europe and should be encouraged. So ODIHR stands ready to assist these important initiatives and looks forward very much this afternoon to the examples of good practice from which we can learn and build on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Manocha, for setting out the values and the structures and framework through which hopefully such cross-sector collaborations can take place. That was most thoughtful, thank you. Having heard our keynotes, we will now move into the first panel, where we'll continue to hear from a variety of different disciplines and people concerning how hate speech came to be a priority for them and the approaches which they are taking to deal with it. It's a pleasure, once again, to welcome Dr. Elizabeta Tkitanovic, Executive Secretary for Human Rights at the Conference of European Churches. Elizabeta.
Thank you, Francis. Welcome to all of you in the panel discussion current initiatives to prevent hate speech in Europe. And we have the panel of distinguished speakers who are going to talk about this issue, each of them 5 minutes. But let's see a little bit what are the reasons for starting these discussions about the initiatives. So we could see that European actors are showing an increased interest in hate speech, identifying it both as harbinger and exhibitor of great social problems, loss of trust, discrimination, and sometimes violence, and recognizing that stopping it may be crucial to halting social compartmentalization and intolerance, which has spiked in recent years. Their efforts include campaigns to raise awareness, build capacity, and bring about policies and laws that address the issue while protecting fundamental freedoms. With religious minority communities strongly affected by hate speech, what we heard previously, cross-sector collaboration can be a challenging but important approach. So in this panel discussion, we are going to inquire current developments to curb hate speech in different contexts across Europe. So our distinguished speakers will have the opportunity to underline why hate speech is increasingly singled out as a target for intervention, then how current events have affected it, and what methods, programs are using to tackle and prevent it. So in this panel, we are going to listen the contributions from the ground and how various organizations are dealing with these issues from the grassroots perspectives. So first on this list is Dr. Kiran Bali, Chair of the United Religions Initiative's Global Council of Trustees, and she will tell us how this organization is dealing with combating hate speech. Dr. Kiran, the floor is yours.
Well, greetings to you all, and thank you, Your Excellency, and all KAICIID colleagues for organising this very important and timely workshop. Let me just begin by saying that hate speech is an extreme form of intolerance which actually contributes to hate crime, and that is not just a criminal justice issue. All public-facing individuals, especially as within faith communities, we have a clear role in prevention and awareness raising, and that is so important. So how can we tackle this as people of faith, as people of interfaith organizations? How can we counter hate speech? We must continue to promote kind communication, love in our speech, built upon the values that we all subscribe to. From a faith perspective, all of our faiths are teaching us about tolerance, acceptance, kindness, compassion, non-violence. So indeed, hate speech goes against what we all stand for. And we must ask ourselves as faith communities, are we practicing as we preach? Visibly, we're seeing hate speech in social media, in various channels, as has already been mentioned. But is it only hate speech if it's being heard and seen? We ask ourselves the question, could hate speech be masked as well? And we need to be clear that hate speech is not just out there somewhere on the internet, it's within communities too. And it's a priority for us because we must uphold the values that our faiths talk about. Before I go into an example of how the URI is dealing with this, I think it's important that as people of faith, we remind ourselves and introspect on our own communications with each other, within organizations and more widely. Are we actually held to account on our communications? Is there a safe space to be able to discuss communications which are full of hate? And why we need to act is because hate speech is the existence of a culture of disrespect, which is growing more and more. And the biggest challenge is that people of faith are actually openly participating in this disrespect. Maybe sometimes through slander, through misinformation, through tarnishing somebody else's representation. We mustn't forget that these are also examples of hate speech, unfortunately more common, and even more so against women and minority groups. We should ask ourselves, do we really call this out? So let me just go on to a little bit about how the pandemic has affected this. Less personal interactions, people feeling generally unsafe within themselves, uncertainty prevailing, but then more and more people becoming keyboard warriors and participating in emails and chat interactions without that personal feeling. We've lost that. But then is it okay for those to make negative points, to make factually incorrect statements and attacking statements just because they're hidden behind a screen? We've got to look at the human aspects of this as well. So the URI is in 110 countries around the world. Grassroots interfaith communities working together to enhance understanding. And what we've been doing is working on how to model and practice right speech, kind speech, the speech of love, how to be kind to one's neighbors, how to stand up for others, and how to respond effectively in the event of hate speech, discrimination, and bullying. What we're doing is providing resource materials, offering information about hate speech, how to recognize hate speech, and then toolkits to help educate others about how we can deal with this. The ways we can respond in kind ways. We can share inspirational stories of those who have spoken up about hate speech and those who are speaking peace in powerful ways. It's so important that we illustrate the power of speech through our faith and spiritual perspectives. That is how we're countering hate speech. I would like to say that people of faith within these communities, within these cooperation circles, are helping to build resilience and something which is very important, networks of support for those who are victims of hate speech, and indeed recognizing that freedom of speech must also be underpinned by respectful communications. That is what our faith teaches, and that is what we should be practicing. Before I conclude, I'd like to say that we must also take a reminder to the principles that we subscribe to as people of faith individually, but also as part of our interfaith organizations. We talk about mutual respect, we talk about cooperation, and we talk about how to be good exemplars of communication. Do we follow codes of conduct? And do we share good practices and challenges amongst our partners? That's an important way that we can continue to work together, sharing the challenges, but then looking at joint codes of conduct where we've effectively tackled this. In conclusion, I'd like to say there's so much good work going on in the ground. There's so many positive approaches with the faith communities, but what we're really working towards is ensuring there's continued a sense of community which is underpinned by respectful communication, resilience, and mutual support for each and every one across all protected characteristics. That is a good way to counter hate speech. Thank you for having me. I will conclude at this moment.
Thank you, Dr. Kiran, for this very short and very clear presentation and keeping on time. That's always helpful. So I will just sum up your presentation with 3 key points that you have mentioned. First is encouraging everybody to combat hate speech within their own communities. And the second point is that there is a network and support for the victims of hate crime and hate speech, and also the valuable material that you have developed. And I would kindly ask you if it's possible that you share the link in the chat, because we are about 70 people on this call, that people and those who would like to learn from your experience can maybe continue and get some inspiration for further work. So thank you so much. Our next speaker is Chief Rabbi Shlomo Hofmeister from Community Rabbi of Vienna. And he is going to tell us about his groundwork and everything what he does in order to combat hate speech on the local, regional, European, and global level. Rabbi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues and friends, to understand the problem of hate speech, and I'm sure we can all make that right connection, we have to find out and we have to see where it comes from. What's behind it? What's the motivation? In these times, in these very challenging times especially, when decisive rhetoric, verbal abuse, slander and defamation have become acceptable tools in politics, which is always a mirror of society, hate speech is today virtually everywhere. And far too often also leads to physical hate crime in consequence. No religion known to me tolerates or even advocates animosity, bigotry, hostility, or hate according to their own codes of ethics. Just as no religion encourages violence, no religion. And yet, always, without exception, politically motivated hate speech, sometimes disguised as theologically justified self-defense, sometimes blatant propaganda, has become a phenomenon which religions have become perceived as being the epitome of. Regretfully, not entirely unjustified so. All of us have experienced, witnessed, and suffered from religion being abused by politics, be it by politicians from outside or by political agenda from within. being a compelling aspect of identity for people and even entire societies. Religion is and has always been in history at the interest not only of those seeking truth, spirituality, and essential meaning in life beyond its transitory existence, but also of those seeking power, influence, and personal gain, be it on a personal or on a national level. Raising suspicions and warnings about the other, justifications for which can always be found, are the easiest method of shifting the focus away from oneself and one's own spiritual values, and even the most basic standards of moral behavior, towards profane political goals. This is abuse of religion. As such, defining oneself by contrasting the other is a disgraceful yet effective key to indoctrinate the many who are lacking the wisdom and knowledge they ought to have in order to truly understand, appreciate, and feel secure in their own religious identity. As one of the 19th century Hasidic masters has phrased it so wisely, if I am I because you are who you are, and you are you because I am who I am, then I'm not I and you are not you. But if I'm I because I am who I am, and you are you because you are who you are, then I can be I and you can be you, and we can talk to each other. Today, hate speech is everywhere, but even though it seems socially acceptable, we must not tolerate it whatsoever, and especially not in God's name. It is simply wrong. It's important, but not enough to formulate laws and legislation against hate speech. Words are merely the result of thoughts. As the 19th century author Charles Rees so famously phrased it, watch your thoughts, they become your words. Watch your words, they become your actions. As religious leaders, it is therefore our utmost responsibility to teach and to educate in practice our constituency, giving them the necessary tools, enabling them to recognize and to withstand such attempts already on the level of thought. It is simply not enough to restrain the tongue, focusing on the ethical values and principles which are at the heart of all religions, teachings, serving as role models ourselves, emphasizing and promoting at all times the utter importance of consequent and consistent manners and respectful behavior towards all of creation, including other peoples. And there must be no tolerance for double standards whatsoever. It cannot be stressed enough. No religion tolerates or even advocates animosity, bigotry, hostility, or hate. Within the codes of ethics, no religion. However, there are unfortunately oftentimes double standards when it comes to distinguishing between how we treat each other within and how we treat the other outside. By tolerating even the smallest amount of such notions, we allow ultimately the abuse of religion for political goals, even against our own principles. And that equals heresy, is a desecration of God's name. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Rabbi Shlomo, for this very valuable input. So you have underlined that it's very important that politicians do not and must avoid instrumentalization and politicization of religion for political purposes, and as well that there is responsibility of religious leaders to teach about ethical values and principles, and there is a need absolutely to avoid double standards, and that there should not be tolerance to these double standards, and also that there is a need of all of us to be confident in our own identity, not contrasting the other in order to confirm our own identity. Thank you so much for these wonderful messages. And now we turn to our third speaker, Professor Maria Maruda, Chair of the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, ECRI in Strasbourg. She is working in the international organization. And Professor Maruda, the floor is yours.
I think you have, yes, the wrong person. So I see on the monitoring someone else. So representing ECRI as chair of the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance. What I can say is how important this dialogue is, the beginning of this endeavor, and indeed the fact that we really need to address ways of preventing and not just repressing, because this is the first point. And secondly, how whatever has been said so far, a monitoring body such as ECRI, European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, taking the pulse of 47 member states of the Council of Europe, indeed has been able to address these issues in two ways. A, through country by country monitoring and publishing our reports. When we are actually doing our monitoring, we have contacts and dialogue not only with governmental authorities, regional and local authorities, but always with religious leaders, with associations, with NGOs representing different minorities that would be the victims themselves of hate speech. And then we publish our reports and where we issue recommendations. So this is one way of addressing the issue. And a second way would be taking stock of this experience, and we have been monitoring the situation in the Council of Europe, 47 member states for the last 27 years. We also adopt what we call general policy recommendations, where we gather this, let's say, expertise, and we share these general policy recommendations with both governments and associations, religious leaders, and NGOs. Indeed, we have one specific general policy recommendation on hate speech. We adopted in 2015, and this is a document that addresses how we can prevent and how we can suppress, if need be, hate speech, codes of conduct, and whatever was mentioned already. Also, about 15 to 20 years ago, we have adopted two general policy recommendations, one on anti-Semitism and one on anti-Muslim hatred. However, 2 years ago, we decided that these general policy recommendations needed to take stock of reality today. Therefore, we are currently revising both of them, and we hope that we will adopt them by the end of this year. So we will have two very important documents on anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred, hopefully by the end of this year, where we will take stock of how hate speech indeed is one of the most important elements to address and counter racism and intolerance in Europe today. And this includes, of course, religious groups, both as victims of this hate speech, but also as leaders that can really help to combat hate speech. Now, in our recent annual report, we published about 4 weeks ago, we do say that because of the pandemic, or that the COVID-19 restricted measures have indeed increased incidents of hate speech towards religious minorities and minorities in general, such as Roma or migrants, for example. But religious minorities are indeed victims of such an increased hate speech. And this we mention in our recent report. Now, if we need to address, however, prevention of hate speech, and this we do as well in our report, preventive measures, first of all, and this was already mentioned, need to tackle specific contexts. So whenever we witness incidents, we have to specifically counter these incidents, and this is extremely important. So we have to understand why COVID-19 virus was connected to certain religious minorities, for example, blaming whole religious communities for the misdeeds of a few, or populist politicians insulting or threatening ethnic or religious minorities in the hope of electoral gain. Indeed, this is something ECRI has monitored and has seen also in the last year. Depicting minorities as criminals, even as terrorists, was another issue that definitely is not supported by any data. And therefore we know that is only used by populist politicians. I would also like to mention something that was not mentioned so far, but we do see in Europe more and more today. Most serious forms of hate speech is perhaps about stirring up hatred against the sometimes ethnically different population adhering to a different religion in a neighboring country, for example, or about people affected by armed confrontations or unresolved conflicts in the Council of Europe today, what we would call gray zones. The best preventive responses do share common features, but as ECRI, we have seen in our monitoring work that we always need to be specific to the context to be as effective as possible. So we do know that the COVID-19 pandemic has fueled hate speech. And another great concern linked to religion and raised by ECRI in our annual report is that indeed terrorist murders committed by certain extremist Islamist terrorists have sparked further intolerance. And we have to say it, to address it, to recognize it, and to find ways of countering it. Finally, in the form of print or online media, what is the role of media in this respect? Indeed, media exercises great influence and therefore has a particular responsibility to make sure it does not promote such hate speech, whether intentionally or inadvertently. To avoid this, for example, and I will mention just one case, Guideline 12.1 of the German Press Codex has recently changed to provide that the affiliation of suspects of crime to ethnic, religious, or other minorities should normally not be mentioned in media reports unless there is a well-founded public interest. So ECRI, in our 6th report on Germany, we have recently published, recalls that such information should only be disclosed by the police if it is strictly necessary and serves a legitimate purpose. On our 6th report on Austria, published in 2020, we have noted with concern that political speech has taken on highly divisive and antagonistic overtones, particularly targeting Muslims, for example. In this report, we recommended that political leaders on all sides take a firm and public stance against the expression of racist hate speech and react to any such expression with a strong counter-hate speech message. And we called on all political parties in Austria to adopt codes of conduct which prohibit the use of hate speech and call on their members and followers to abstain from using it. Of course, we have always mentioned education as a way of preventing hate speech in schools, and we have a general policy recommendation on addressing discrimination, racism, and intolerance in and through education in schools. This would be general policy recommendation number 10. So we do have ways to address and tools to address hate speech. And it's only a matter of finding the correct balance between prevention and repression and possibly sanctions, for example, against political parties, cutting of funding, etc., etc. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Maruda, for this very good report and explanation of what ECRI does and about its monitoring mechanisms, which is basically available to all stakeholders who are participating in this meeting, to the civil society, academia, religious communities, etc., and that they are free to report and to send directly to you and on the website of ECRI. I have been using also myself lots of times email address where I have been also reporting and like certain issues related to discrimination in this field. So it is very good for us to know that you are updating current policy recommendations on anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred. And also, if it's possible, it would be great in the chat if you can just paste this recommendation from 2015, because it is also very important that all stakeholders present in this talk and this debate can use them. It is worrying to see this increasing trend of increasing during COVID-19 pandemic, hate speech against and targeting against religious communities. It is very worrying, as you said, also against refugees, migrants and asylum seekers, different ethnic communities. So basically, it stays, after this information, it's also very important that we continue working, all of us together in this direction. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Suad Oniselka, Assistant Rector of the City of Helsinki Education and Training Authority. So we are moving now from international organization perspective to the educational perspective. So Suad, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to come to talk to here. Your Excellency, dear colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, as you know quite well in Finland, the national policies are preventing violent radicalization and hate speech. Those things are pretty much in order. There are several projects ongoing in schools. For example, in national curricula, there's a recognition of hate speech in Finnish language. And for example, there are training for teaching staff and other professionals in schools, how to conduct difficult discussions related to issues such as hate speech, racist behavior, and the signals of the radicalization. However, today I want to mention something on the grassroots level, because all these nice projects, they don't alone solve the problems. Sometimes the projects where the minorities are objects of the project, they can even worsen the actual issue. There are teachers, for example, who project their prejudices towards the students and pupils who belong to the minorities. Normal religious practices are seen as a sign of radicalization sometimes. For example, saying Ramadan Mubarak is seen as unwanted religious practice, but saying Merry Christmas is seen cultural practice, not religious one. So majority issues are cultural and proven ones, but minority issues are unwanted religion ones. So let me explain more in details. For example, when Christmas time is coming closer, the students and pupils are telling about their plans, all the adults at school, what makes them happy on that special time. It brings a lot of positive memories, and as a community, we understand the meaning of that special Christmas time. What happened in my own school, where I have been working now 2 years, the Ramadan started last Tuesday, and the school where I used to work as a head teacher several years, the Ramadan was not an issue to give all kind of instructions to the teachers, parents, or the students. It was part of our normal school year. Because 1/3 of the students, they are Muslims there, so religious practices are quite well known. At my current school, even though they are Muslims, like 1/4 of the students, the religious practices are not very well known among the school staff. So they have forbidden before certain age groups, for example, to practice their religion. There's no negotiations, no open discussions. The speech of the staff produces in no means constructive, as we use a constructive pedagogy in our school, or we call it also problem-solving pedagogy. So let me go more in the details. We have a lot of very cute pupils who come to tell their eyes are shining. They tell to the teachers that, oh, now it's a special time starting, we have Ramadan, and how they are waiting for it and how special they feel when the families are preparing for that time. I was quite surprised to see that some of our adults in our work community, the response was not positive at all, quite the opposite. Within few words, the adults had stopped the shining in the eyes of those students, and they had made the children sad. They were saying that Ramadan is not good, it's a very hard thing, fasting, it's not even humane, and even determining like who's allowed to practice fasting during the Ramadan. Nobody was seeing anything positive about holy month of fasting. So this discussion actually continued. On other level, as the principals, we met, and there was issue like, should we inform the schools on the level of the city, how the Ramadan should be celebrated for the parents. The instructions were involved in this issue were actually belonging to under the law of freedom of religion, what I was quite surprised. They were giving strict age limits and not understanding really the diversity among the Muslim community. I needed to explain that we don't have strict age limits, and it's also good that the children, they can practice with their own limits. The problem, it's very easy to recognize hate speech when it happens and it's very aggressive. There is no question about it later on, was it that hate speech or not? But when the hate speech is done in polite way, or there's good meaning behind it, they try to help the minorities. Like in this case, I think most of the school staffs, they wanted to help parents to solve the problems of Ramadan. It's not that easy to recognize. If the recognition doesn't happen, you cannot even correct those structures. So this Ramadan actually showed to me as deputy principal that we have still a long way to go what comes to the Finnish school system and the inclusive school, what we should have. The question is like, are the Muslim pupils as inclusive in our school than other religious minorities? They should be entitled to enjoy Ramadan, not only explaining like, oh, that's not that bad as it sounds. This is only one example about the structural discrimination and the negative attitudes in our school system. And the saddest part of that, it's like the victims are actually children. But we shouldn't actually lose from the hope. It also shows that we need still a lot of negotiations. We need a lot of open communications. And then now when we have recognized the problem, we can solve it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sud, for this very interesting example coming from Finland, and the way you're trying to approach to solve this problem and all the steps that you have taken to analyze the problem, to see what is going on, and then to go step forward in solving of this. One issue which came very strongly, like from your input, and that is the recognition about religious practice. In this, you have been speaking about, celebrating Ramadan, the fasting and so on. And also, there are still also other traditions. We are practicing fasting in different way, but still it is very welcome from the side of religious communities, and all believers are invited to follow this process because practicing religious commitments actually help to people and to students and to all of us to strengthen our faith and to strengthen our identity. But it is good to see that you're seeking the open dialogue to address this issue. And I hope that very soon the society will have the ears and warm heart to congratulate and to encourage Muslim students to celebrate Ramadan, because it is something good, and it's something good for the body and for the soul of believers. Thank you so much for your input. Last speaker for this panel discussion is Ambassador David Fernandez Puyana, Permanent Observer at the United Nations for Peace to the United Nations in Geneva. So he's going to tell us about the example how university is dealing in addressing hate speech. So, Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank KAICIID for organizing the expert consultation on countering hate speech in Europe in cooperation with the European Council of Religious Leaders. My greetings and thanks also goes to His Excellency Mr. Faisal bin Muaammar for his vision, efforts and leadership in this workshop, alongside with his wonderful team and the Deputy Secretary General, Ambassador Álvaro Albacete, and also my thanks to our moderator, Elisabetta, for your work, and also Miss Frances Rose for your cooperation. Let's be clear today. Nowadays, there exists a disturbing rise of xenophobia, racism, and intolerance in the world, including in Europe. Social media and other forms of communication are being exploited as platforms for bigotry and hate speech. In this sense, violence committed in the name of religion can lead to massive violations of human rights, including the freedom of religion or belief. In order to tackle the disturbing rise of hate speech, the mutual understanding and interreligious dialogue constitute important dimensions of the dialogue among civilizations and the culture of peace. In this sense, the University for Peace, established by the General Assembly of the United Nations in 1980, also took some actions in this regard. In the past month, we have signed 3 important agreements of cooperation with key actors in the world, namely the Pontifical Lateran University of Vatican, the Muslim World League, and the World Jewish Congress. With all of them, we have the purpose to promote dialogue and cooperation through encountering all kinds of extremism, including Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and Christianophobia. We have also a memorandum of understanding with KAICIID, our brother in this important endeavor. Let me share with you 3 examples and good practices in our cooperation with them. In October 2019, the Pontifical Lateran University, UNESCO, and the UN University for Peace, in cooperation with the Embassy of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, we organized the exhibition on Calligraphy for Dialogue, promote the culture of peace through culture and art, of the well-known artist, Saudi artist, Mr. Othman Al-Qujayem, in the city of the Vatican. The presence of His Holiness Pope Francis at the opening was an asset for the success of the exhibition. In November 2020, the Muslim World League, in cooperation with the University for Peace, launched in Jeddah the book entitled Promoting Peace, Human Rights, and Dialogue Among Civilizations, alongside the Vatican, the European Union, Costa Rica, and Spain. 32 scholars and organizations participated in the book, such as diplomats, high UN staff, artists, and academics. Also, the World Jewish Congress, KAICIID, and UNESCO sent their contributions to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. In March 2021, the Universal Rights Group, the UN University for Peace, and the World Wipf Congress organized an event on the spread of conspiracy myths online and its implications for human rights within the context of the Human Rights Council, with the participation with the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of opinion and expression, and Oxford Internet Institute and UNESCO. And finally, I would like to announce that we are preparing a second volume which will incorporate the human rights dimension to the interfaith dialogue, thanks to the reflections and contributions from high UN staff members, scholars, and distinguished diplomats and ambassadors. The launching will take place in June in the city of Brussels, together with the European Union institutions and Costa Rica, among others. Thank you very much, Ms. Elisabetta, for your cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for this input and about the material and the progress which are going to follow in June. As I'm here based in Brussels, looking forward if it will be, let's say, live or possible to attend one of these programs, it would be great. But also for other colleagues who are also in this panel and based in Brussels and maybe would like to hear a little bit also more in the discussion rooms after this plenary session. So we unfortunately do not have time for additional questions among the panelists. So we will need to move into the breakout rooms. And I see that there is lots of interest from the colleagues from Bosnia and Herzegovina to explain also about their models, and other colleagues sharing their own experience. But unfortunately, we need to close now plenary and to move to the breakout rooms. And you can bring the valuable experience in the breakout rooms. So thank you so much for participating, and Francis, the floor is yours.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome gently back. Thank you for joining in with these breakout sessions. As we realize there is, of course, not much time for people to report back from them, in case there is a point that you found was very important, please be assured that we have captured it in the minutes. But in case you wish to share it, you're more than welcome to put it into the chat in case there was something which you feel everybody should know. We are delighted to have a lively chat. Otherwise, allow me to welcome you to the second half of the expert consultation on countering hate speech through interfaith dialogue and multi-stakeholder partnerships. Having heard a great deal about the causes of hate speech and current initiatives to prevent it in Europe, this next panel will look into the work to deal with its effects. I am delighted for this to invite our moderator, Nayana Jayarajan, Deputy Director of Communications at KAICIID, who will be moderating the panel to introduce herself. Nayana, over to you.
Thank you so much, Francis. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. And if you're joining us for the first time, welcome to the expert consultation on countering hate speech through interfaith cooperation and multi-stakeholder partnership. So earlier today and in the first panel, we heard from a number of experts on how hate speech is defined and how its effects on societies and minority communities, and efforts ongoing by policy institutions and religious communities to tackle it, followed by a very robust discussion in the breakout sessions on how the pandemic may have worsened or changed efforts to counter hate speech. In this second panel, then, we look forward to delving a little bit more into this last aspect, which is what impacts does hate speech have on societies and communities? So how can community relations which have been damaged by hate speech be restored or repaired? What does accountability and reparation for victims of hate speech look like? And what kind of partnerships exist or need to exist to help these initiatives to succeed? My name is Nayana Jayarajan. I'm moderating the session on behalf of the co-organizers of today's meeting, the International Dialogue Center, KAICIID. At KAICIID, we have seen firsthand the impact of hate speech and the consequences that it can have on societies in different stages of conflict. We've been involved in convening partnerships and discussions between religious institutions and policymakers at a number of different levels, especially on how to deal with the possible consequences of hate speech and how those can be mitigated. For example, our partnership with the UN Special Representative on the Prevention of Genocide on the Action Plan for Religious Leaders on the Prevention of Incitement to Violence, which may lead to atrocity crimes, was geared specifically towards equipping religious communities with the skills to recognize and address hate speech before it escalates into violence. In the Central African Republic, where hate speech exacerbates already fragile inter-community relations, we work with journalists on conflict-sensitive reporting and avoiding hate speech in their coverage. In Myanmar and the Arab region, we work with religious and interfaith communities to promote peace speech or counter-narratives via Facebook and other social media, for example, on WhatsApp. There's not a region in the world, unfortunately, that has not been impacted by the consequences of hate speech, and we in Europe are absolutely no exception. And that's why we're so pleased to have with us a spectrum of expert speakers who have been working on these issues from very different perspectives and who we look forward to learning from. To the speakers, each of you will have 5 minutes to present your work and your thoughts, after which I hope we can discuss some questions. I would invite our participants, please, to pose any questions that they have to the speakers in the chat, and hopefully we can get to some of them in the session, time permitting. But if not, we can definitely get into them during the breakout sessions. I'd like to turn now to our first speaker, Ms. Christy J. Edwards, who is the Deputy Head of Tolerance and Non-Discrimination at the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. Ms. Edwards, may I invite you, please, to start us off?
Sure, thanks so much for having me. I hope you can all hear me well. I will try to keep my remarks fairly brief, as I know there's a lot to get through today. So I'd like to discuss the broader subject of efforts addressing the effects of hate speech from the angle of best practices for joint action, particularly focusing on how faith actors and national authorities can achieve the best effects working together. And before I do that, I want to provide a little bit of context to explain why the potential and importance of faith actors and national authorities working collaboratively to address these issues is so important. Obviously, hate speech and the related phenomenon of scapegoating often derive from political and societal discourses. And we've seen that the COVID pandemic has made the relationship between scapegoating, hate speech, and hate crime quite salient. And of course, the negative effects of these manifestations of intolerance have particularly affected minoritized communities. And so while people around the world have been affected by the pandemic, it's also important to note that some of these groups were already in a position of vulnerability before the pandemic even started. This year, we've noted through our annual hate crime report that violent acts against particular groups and communities continues to be a concern across the OSCE region, but that already existing types of racism, xenophobia, and other types of intolerance also now emerge as acts of intolerance and discrimination related to the pandemic. Some of these minority communities were negatively portrayed by the general public, ranging from ordinary citizens to high-level politicians and policymakers, and also in the media. In our report that came out last summer on the human dimension commitments and state responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, intolerance and discrimination have been significantly directed towards people perceived to be of Asian descent, and individuals perceived to be of Asian descent particularly seem to have been disproportionately targeted in hate incidents. And by July of 2020, ODIHR had received reports of hate incidents against individuals in quite a number of OSCE participating states. I won't go into all of them due to the time, but I can list those off for you later if folks are interested. The recent mass shooting of 6 Asian Americans also in the United States provide an unfortunate example of the escalatory nature of this type of discrimination, where political scapegoating legitimizes hate speech and, if left unchecked, can result in fatal hate crimes. And we're clearly seeing that the trajectory of intolerance could not be clearer. The recent escalation of hate crimes against the Asian American community in the United States also serves as a powerful reminder that while the primary responsibility for acts of intolerance and discrimination rests with states, this responsibility is not always upheld. And so in this context, the importance of the work of faith actors and civil society more generally becomes amplified, and cooperation between faith actors and national authorities becomes crucial. So at ODIHR, we believe that interfaith cooperation and multi-stakeholder partnerships operating in the freedom of religion and belief human rights framework is critical to effectively and consistently challenging hate speech. The impact of hate, discrimination, and intolerance is often overwhelming on the targeted communities, and solidarity can make all the difference to those impacted. Faith and religious leaders are uniquely placed to show their communities that the path of solidarity and to work with national authorities is very effective in challenging hateful rhetoric. Furthermore, when diverse communities choose to stand together and with national authorities across divides in the face of hate, they also act in a very powerful manner against structural and institutionalized forms of discrimination, because these kinds of collaborations, through their simple existence and then through their work, challenge pillars that sustain the structures of inequality. It's also important to acknowledge that interreligious work and collaborations, coalition building amongst faith leaders and national authorities is extremely complex and, importantly, highly contextualized. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, but there are several general principles and practices detailed in ODIHR's Freedom of Religion and Belief and Security policy guidance and our coalition building for tolerance and non-discrimination toolkit, as well as I know we've discussed the UN Plan of Action on Hate Speech, amongst other sources. So we could probably talk about this for the whole session, but I want to talk about just a few good practices in the few minutes that I have. Number one, partnerships between faith actors and national authorities should identify which key actors in which configurations could be effective in addressing and countering hate speech, and create opportunities for these actors to discuss the challenges and opportunities of addressing hate speech. Number two, dialogue and engagement initiatives between states and religious or belief communities on issues pertaining to freedom of religion or belief and security, working on hate crimes, should advance freedom of religion and belief for all, prevent and counter discrimination on grounds of religion or intolerance on grounds of religion or belief, including by speaking out strongly and promptly against advocacy of hate crimes or hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. Ensure broad-based and sustainable security, be open to participation by the full range of religious or belief communities in society, respect the autonomy of religion or belief communities. And I have a couple more of the suggestions, but maybe I'll save those for the breakout discussion groups in the interest of time. And lastly, good practice number three, given the highly contextualized nature of both hate speech and interreligious engagements, partnerships between faith actors and national authorities or coalitions should encourage the reframing of hate speech concerns and appropriate responses in a way that's in accordance with international human rights law, acknowledges the challenges of addressing hate speech in accordance with international human rights law, recognizes the rights of victims, particularly their rights to freedom of opinion and expression, acknowledge the underlying societal and structural factors which make people susceptible to hate speech, and use local vernacular and language that's appropriate in the country context. So I'm aware of time, but wanted to give just a couple practical examples where we've seen these good practices at play. In Germany, since 2016, the Federal Foreign Office has stepped up its efforts to make religious communities strategic partners in the work to promote peace. They've held several conferences with the aim of developing a global network of religious representatives working for peace in their countries and communities, and with the aim of discussing various religions' potential to foster peace and security, or peace in society, and to link this more closely with German foreign policy. And the idea is also to work with different faiths and faith-based organizations with shared interests such as peace and stability as strategic partners in a sustainable network. And I also want to quickly mention Religion for Peace's interreligious councils, which are the mechanism through which Religions for Peace engages religious leaders and their communities in multi-religious cooperation to transform conflict, promote peace, and advance sustainable development. I know we're going to hear a little bit about this later on, so I won't go into to the details, but just want to note that many of the 90 interreligious councils around the world have confirmed that they've been working with state authorities on aspects of hate speech and multiple forms of discrimination dynamics over the last 50 years. So perhaps for the sake of time, I'll stop there. There's a lot more to discuss and look forward to continuing the conversation and perhaps providing a few more examples during the Q&A session.
Thank you so much. I'd just like to highlight what you pointed out about the importance of interfaith cooperation with national authorities, solidarity, speaking out against hate speech, and also the focus that you placed on the escalatory nature of hate speech, which is a focus for this panel discussion. Thank you so much. I'd like to hand over now to our next speaker, Dr. Daniel Höltgen, Council of Europe Special Representative on Anti-Semitic and Anti-Muslim Hatred and Hate Crimes. Dr. Höltgen, please.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I am really honored that I can make a contribution and share some of my thoughts with you today. Your work is very valuable for mine, as I've discovered today, but not only today, but by reading through your documents. The Council of Europe, which I represent, has, of course, a very clear rules about hatred and freedom of religion and hate speech and hatred against religion and hatred against any minority group and racism. This comes from the basis of all our work, which is the European Convention on Human Rights. For example, Article 14 of the Convention is the prohibition of discrimination of any kind. And Article 9 is freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, which have to be guaranteed across the 47 member states. Now, much of the discussion today has focused on hate speech, which is also a priority of mine, and on online hate speech, simply because it magnifies and exacerbates the harm that can be done through words, and that hateful words can lead, and often unfortunately lead, to hate crimes. And we have spoken about the rise of anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, and other kinds of hate crimes during the pandemic. But of course, the question that is always put and the argument that is put against action against hate speech is freedom of expression. And this, of course, has been used many times by internet providers or internet platforms, that they can't do anything about hurtful or other posts because it is freedom of expression, at least under US law. Now, the convention is very clear on freedom of expression. It says that it is a fundamental right, and this is Article 10 of our convention, and that it is the pillar of any democracy. However, freedom of expression is not an absolute right, even though it is allowed to offend, shock, and disturb. It cannot go against other fundamental rights, such as the victim's right to private life or the prohibition of discrimination. So open racism and Holocaust denial, for example, are certainly not covered by freedom of expression. And I think it is our job to make the big platforms realize this, and that they cannot continue to do business on the basis of simply allowing anything to go through. And this is why I am pleased that there are many initiatives, including from the Council of Europe, to address the issue of online hate speech. One initiative is, of course, the proposal for a Digital Service Act by the European Commission, which was adopted some time ago, which does foresee very, very clear liability for internet platforms if they allow such hate speech to be distributed and to cause harm. We are looking at it from a human rights point of view, and this is why at the end of this year, the Council of Europe will put forward a comprehensive recommendation to all of its 47 member states on combating hate speech, and it will take into account the judgments of our court, the national experience, for example, by the German national law on network enforcement, and it will also look at things which are not blatantly and clearly illegal, such as Holocaust denial. It will also look at the aspects of clearly harmful but not illegal hate speech and the damage that that can do. We are of the opinion that governments must ensure that hate speech laws are implemented scrupulously at all levels. Sometimes it is not necessary to invent new rules and laws, they just need to be implemented. Governments must identify and remove conditions in society that are conducive to hate speech, including raising public awareness and providing education. And this is something that we have done in the context of our No Hate Speech movement, which many of you may know, where we reach out to young people, encourage them to counter speech, and to increase their media or their social media literacy. And also we should withdraw support for any organization, political or otherwise, that encourages hate speech. As the special representative for anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim and other forms of intolerance, religious intolerance, hate speech and hate crimes, I have focused very clearly on anti-Semitism and what is happening at the moment. And for example, the death threats that have been issued on Twitter in France against members of the Jewish community are totally unacceptable. And I would draw your attention to the fact that a group of NGOs, including the Jewish Student Union of France, has launched a case against Twitter, not for the first time, which will have to be decided in May, because a mediation process between Twitter and the NGOs has failed. This is about notifying Twitter, and Twitter then not doing enough about it, which means not taking enough not taking enough measures to take illegal hate speech off the platform. Inspired by this work, I have started to consult with Muslim organizations in Europe, how they see online hate speech. And the first results that I'm receiving indicate that actually that is a growing problem. But Muslims, like in general life in Europe, are less inclined to report it, sometimes don't know where to report it, but that it is an increasing problem. And I would like to close by saying, to make the link again between words and deeds, it's the German presidency of the Council of Europe at the moment, and Chancellor Merkel spoke this morning. She made reference to hate crimes. Two very hurtful and painful events for Germany occurred in the recent years: the attack on the synagogue in Halle, and then the murder of 9 people of mainly immigrant and Muslim background in Hanau. Both were inspired on the internet. The perpetrators were inspired by hate speech on the internet, and they actually wanted to stream their deeds. So the danger is real and present. We are working on this recommendation. I'm working with religious communities on this very specific aspect, and I'm glad that we can share our experience here today. That would be my intervention for this moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hiltgen, for raising several very, very important points, but also for rooting us in policy and the regulatory aspect of this discussion, but also raising this very important issue of the role of technology platforms and the regulation of technology platforms and what avenues are available in that regard, and also this related perceived conflict between freedom of expression and the regulation of hate speech. Which I'm sure we'll get into more discussion in the breakout groups. One of the initiatives that you mentioned is actually the subject of our next presenter's intervention. I'd like to now invite Ms. Alessandra Coppola, who is the board member of the No Hate Speech Network and vice coordinator of the No Hate Speech movement in Italy. Alessandra, please.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be invited to this meeting, and I had the opportunity to be with you also in the Vienna conference in 2019. So thank you very much, KAICIID, for inviting me again, and to the European Conference of Religious Leaders. I'm here today invited to represent the No Hate Speech Network. That is an international network that was set after the like a legacy for the continuation of the No Hate Speech movement of Council of Europe. That was an initiative that the Council of Europe started in 2013 as a response to a massive massacre that was the one preceding another terrible massacre that was mentioned before, that was the Christchurch attack. So unfortunately, the Christchurch attack that is more recent and more known was not a random type of hate crime. It was done on a model that is the Utoya attack. The Utoya massacre happening in July 2011, during which around 70 young people lose their life because of the idea of an inclusive society, and because of their idea of the diversity of beliefs and religions, and also of origins that can be combined into the society. So in order to respond to that happening, the Advisory Council of Youth, that is a co-management body inside of the Council of Europe, so a unique also experience of co-managing policies between the institutions and the young people, decided to build a massive campaign across the world in order to give a response and to give a positive response to hate speech leading to hate crimes. So in that moment, the idea was to build a youth-led campaign in order to prevent and report hate speech. So these two were the initial pillars of the activism of the young people around the Council of Europe member states, and we had national campaign committees in the different member states of the Council of Europe and beyond, because we had also some campaigns happening in Canada, in Mexico, and in Tunisia, for example, just to give you the idea of the dimension of the initiative. And these two first activities, so preventing and reporting hate speech, were built on the definition of the ECRL definition of hate speech contained in the policy recommendation that was previously mentioned. And the idea was to use educational activities based on the bookmarks tool that we developed during the campaigns. That is an educational manual containing non-formal education activities to work with young people preventing hate speech, and also reporting the hate speech specifically online to the social media platforms, and also to police when it was the case, advised especially that the situation was going towards a hate crime or something very harmful that has to be reported to the police. After 2 years of experience in this campaign, we understood that something was missing, because also following the evolution of the social media platforms, we saw that it was needed something in addition to the reporting and the preventing activities. So a third pillar was developed in 2016, that was the counter and alternative narrative activities. So a new manual was also developed, that is the WeCan, as I mentioned, that is here. All these resources are can be downloaded for free from the Council of Europe website. And so this third pillar was based on acquiring skills and abilities to produce and apply a counter or alternative narrative online to hate incidents. The main difference between the counter and alternative narrative is in the timing in which they happen, and the different also outcome that we have with these two different activities that normally or many times are called as synonyms, but they are not, because a counter narrative is something that has a short long-term impact and aims to reverse something that is happening now in a specific moment, in a specific place. So I develop a narrative that aims to respond to a precise incident. An alternative narrative indeed is something that has a long-term impact because aims to reverse the phenomenon in the society in a transversal way and in a more long-term perspective. So my aim is to reverse the phenomenon per se, not connected to a specific incident. So after 5 years of campaigning in all these different countries, the Council of Europe decided to finalize, to terminate the central coordination of the campaigns, and also invited the activists to take a step to continue these initiatives at a national level and also internationally, but in a self-organized way. So what happened was that at national levels, different campaigns continued, like for example in Italy, and in this moment I'm a vice coordinator of the campaign in my country, but also the young people who were trained during 5 years, and also the organization who participated in this big and long initiative decided to gather together and create and build a network that is totally youth-led and self-led, meaning that is an international activities that an international network that totally came out of these Council of Europe initiative is continuing the legacy together also with the institution, but from the civil society perspective. In this moment, the No Hate Speech Network is also observer of the work of the expert group that is working on the drafting of the new recommendation on hate speech that has a more comprehensive view. And it's a more inclusive on what is hate speech and how should we react to that. And just to give also some hints that are connected with the other previous speakers, actually the No Hate Speech Network adopted a code of conduct that also take into consideration not only the diversity, but also the religious sensitivity and any kind of for example, language, diversity, any issue that can lead to any harmful language that need to be avoided also in our internal work. So it's also an ongoing training for us to be in line with what we foster. During the pandemic,
I'm so sorry to have to cut you off, but I wonder if you might be able to post some of the links to the resources that you're mentioning in the chat, and perhaps we can continue the discussion in the breakout session, because I think that many of the points that you've raised, I found that they were also echoing some of the discussions in the earlier breakout sessions. Before I move on to the next speaker, though, I'd just like to highlight the importance or what struck me in terms of the partnership model that you were talking about, the similarity in tactics that we can observe, not just in the instigators of the hate speech, but in the response tactics that your movement is adopting. Thank you so much for those very concrete best practices as well. And I'd like to now invite our fourth speaker, Mr. Henri Nichols, who is the policy coordinator of the Institutional Cooperation and Networks Unit of the EU's Fundamental Rights Agency. Mr. Nichols, please.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the invitation. I think my input will inevitably go over things that have already been said because this is the nature of such events. But I would like to start by saying that indeed no one is immune from hatred, and it's a phenomenon that knows no boundaries, and obviously it festers online, as we have heard. Hatred can be anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, target other religions. It can also be racist, xenophobic, homophobic, sexist, misogynistic, ageist, or target persons with disabilities. And the spread of hatred is driven by intolerance of difference and by ignorance, and perpetrators are found across the social spectrum. And many people, probably some of you who are here today, are the targets of steady streams of vile abuse and language, including online. And this abuse sometimes morphs into harassment, violent attacks, and even death threats. And evidence collected by the Fundamental Rights Agency and other evidence show that experiencing such abuse can have long-term negative psychological consequences on people, including feelings of anger, fear, annoyance, embarrassment, or shame, as well as it can limit their participation in society. In other words, we can say that hatred strikes at the core of human dignity, and combating it demands a comprehensive, rights-based and concerted approach, which will be the second part of my input. So unless we act decisively, incitement to discrimination, hatred, or violence risks becoming ever more normalized in public discourse, media content, and political rhetoric, never mind online. And I think we can all recognize that combating hatred and minimizing its negative impact is a task fraught with difficulties. We also need to recognize, however, that we are duty-bound to take up this task without reservation or hesitation. We cannot let anyone abuse our right of freedom to expression as a means to justify inertia, inaction, or half measures in combating hatred. So what can be done? I would suggest maybe a comprehensive rights-based approach to tackling hatred. And such an approach puts protecting and safeguarding human dignity at its core. And this entails recognizing that the right to freedom of expression is not absolute, as has already been alluded to today. All relevant international legal instruments allow for restrictions to this right under strict conditions. And the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights provide guidance on when restrictions are legitimate and proportional. So when implementing a rights-based approach to combating hatred, we need to remind ourselves also of states' legal and political commitments in this area. And this is also why it's important, I think, to have OD here today, because many states have taken commitments under that framework. So on a practical level, 6 concrete areas of work where action can be taken to combat hatred could be highlighted. None of these areas of work are new or revolutionary in their own right, and some of them are already in operation in some countries and some regions. But rather, bringing these areas of work together under an action plan or a strategy could help pool efforts and resources towards achieving our common goal of combating hatred. So what are these 6 areas of work? First, we need to understand hatred to clarify the boundaries between freedom of expression and incitement to hatred. This would involve analysis of relevant jurisprudence as well as social research on attitudes to and experiences of hatred among different population groups. Second, we need to monitor hatred to enable the development of targeted policy and law enforcement measures and responses. This could involve, for example, setting up units and law enforcement agencies that would detect online hatred in cooperation with other partners where relevant and possible. Third, we need to encourage reporting and improve recording of hatred with a view to enabling people to access remedies. This implies providing guidance to people as to where and how they can report incidents of hatred, whether to law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, national human rights institutions, national equality bodies, internet providers, IT companies, or civil society organizations. And this also implies that appropriate recording systems need to be put in place within any organization or body to which hatred is reported. Fourth, we need to prosecute hatred to ensure that perpetrators are brought to account. And providing victims of hatred with redress includes prosecuting perpetrators to the full extent of the law. Fifth, and related, we need to provide support to victims of hatred to ensure that their rights are fully respected and that they receive adequate support. The 6th area would be educating against hatred to ensure that people can respond adequately when they are faced with hatred. For example, although no one is immune to online hatred, this does not mean that people cannot be inoculated against it. This can be achieved by increasing media literacy, by improving critical reading skills with regard to media content, including online, developing counter narratives or alternative narratives, civic education, or simply communicating on the value of respecting rights. So to finish, I think that religious actors would have a role to play under each of these areas. And the question is to know how to involve them meaningfully in these processes. And this can be the subject of further discussions today and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for highlighting the importance of that rights-based approach that puts human dignity at its very center. I think that's something that has been the focus of many discussions on how religious actors can also be involved in preventing hate speech. And also for these 6 areas of action, which I think provide a really useful framework for discussing what kind of initiatives and partnerships might be possible in the breakout sessions. So thank you very much for that. I'd now like to invite our last speaker, Ms. Emina Friliak, who is board member of the European Interfaith Youth Network of Religions for Peace Europe. Emina, please.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Good afternoon from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and thank you very much for your invitation. It's an honor and pleasure to speak among these distinguished speakers. In my 5 minutes, I'll try to give you a short overview of our initiative called Alter Hate and Practices and Experiences, as well as some challenges that we actually encountered, followed by some recommendations. So our initiative is created by young people gathered around European Interfaith Youth Network of Religions for Peace and young people coming from the 3 Western Balkan countries, which are Albania, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Serbia. All the contents and activities were created as a joint effort of these young people. So our campaign has 3 pillars, let's say, activities of education and sensitization, raising awareness about the existence of very existence of hate speech and its consequences, as well as advocating for acceptance and diversity and inclusion through counter and alternative narratives. But how we did this? Our initiative consists of online and offline efforts and emphasis is on online sphere because we are in a COVID-19 pandemic, so most of these things are done online. Our offline activities consisted of seminar in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also street actions in Serbia and Albania, aimed at educating and raising awareness about very existence of hate speech. On the other side, much more efforts were put into online sphere, and those consisted of sharing messages of 2 types. First one, those were positive messages, but other were messages that were critically assessing the state of hate speech within the communities of young people, such as messages asking and advocating for proper legislation, but also those questioning using hate speech for the purpose of political or populist purposes. So these messages were designed by very young people who are coming from different communities and who know the situation where they actually live. Another type of activities we have workshops and webinars that were streamed online, and they are aimed at educating about hate speech. And these activities were more in intergenerational manner, because each of the webinars we try to gather young people, but also seniors to speak about the topic and address the topic from different angles: religious angle, legal angle, media angle, political angle, etc. The intergenerational perspective was important for us also to debunk the myth that hate speech is only a problem of young people and that only activities need to be aimed at young people. So the webinars were gathering religious leaders, faith-based actors, young people, civil society actors, but also representatives of different initiatives that are aimed at countering hate speech, because this is important part. This cross-sectoral and cross-initiative collaboration is extremely important to address and successfully counter hate speech. This very meeting that we are now here is a great example of this kind of activity. Until now, we organized various online workshops for young people, for religious leaders, also for faith actors, for faith-based and civil society actors. Just recently, we had one with United Religions Initiatives, and we are preparing one workshop for young people in May in collaboration with Youth Peace Initiative from the Netherlands. So our campaign is going beyond Western Balkans. It's going more on a European level now. So finally, as European Interfaith Youth Network, for us, it was important to root our narrative in interfaith perspective. And on the occasion of the World Interfaith Harmony Week, we decided to debunk and counter hate speech from the perspective of creating no hate speech rule poster from the religious perspective. So we decided to ground the poster in 11 different religious traditions and showcase invaluable examples from faith scriptures and traditions that encourage speaking positively and with respect, while prohibiting harmful, poisonous, or vicious speech that can disrupt, incite, or even produce violence among people. When it comes to challenges, then we definitely have to speak about it, that it's very necessary that your message comes and reach those who necessarily don't agree with you. And that's always a challenge with the campaigns and with the project. Another challenge is that hate speech is very much omnipresent syntagma, but mostly people don't know what exactly it is. They don't know, how to recognize it, and then they are not reacting to it. They are not reporting, they are not countering it. So this is something that we perceive through the campaign. So online spaces and social media gives us enormous chances to reach different target groups. And this is something that we have to utilize. Throughout our campaign, our social media was visited even by those who are not agreeing with us. They were leaving comments like questioning our messages, claiming that hate speech doesn't exist, etc., etc. All of these people we actually conversed with them. We didn't want to ignore them. We didn't want to censor them because they were not employing hate speech. If hate speech was employed, they would be definitely reported. So it's really important that we have a person who will take care of the social media and be able to converse with people, but taking care that your platform does not turn into hate speech platform. And finally, what was important for us is to create contents that will reflect diversity, that will counter hate speech as a problem that affects all of us, and create a platform that sends a message that people of different backgrounds are supporting diverse groups of people, not some specific groups, and that in our case, this was an interfaith effort, which actually gave it an added value. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amina, for that example of an initiative to counter hate speech that is grounded in religious traditions and interfaith work, and giving us all a picture of what that might look like. And also for your emphasis, which brings us really back to the opening session, on a cross-sectoral, transnational, multi-stakeholder partnership approach, which is something that we're all aiming for from this event. Unfortunately, I don't think that we will have time for questions in this session. And I'd like to apologize to all of our speakers because each of you raised issues which I think might have occupied the entire event itself. And I do apologize for the time constraints that we put on you. But I hope that during the breakout session now, we can also delve a little bit deeper into these issues in smaller groups and think about what concrete initiatives or partnership ideas we might be able to come up with. I'll hand over now back to our MC, Francis, with further instructions. But again, thank you so much to all of our speakers and to all of the participants.